Okay, so we are live. So thank you for joining me. We are streaming this. My name is Trish from Downtown Book and Sound in downtown, beautiful, sunny downtown Salinas, and I'm here with the author Phyllis Perry, who has agreed to join us and talk about her awesome book, California Disasters. And let's see if I can get the reflection off of it a little bit so you can see it. So these are true stories of the Golden State tragedies and triumphs. So very interesting. And I want to thank you for joining us today. So, Phyllis just told me that we're having a beautiful sunny day here in Salinas, California. And Phyllis told me that it is snowing currently.
Yes, right here in Boulder, Colorado. It was funny 2 days ago. Matter of fact, temperatures in the 70s and 80s, but today it's snow. So we call this a sort of a typical day that you don't expect in Colorado. But somehow every April and May, after we think the snows are over, there's always one more coming.
Well, thank you for taking the time to join us. And I wanted to make this disclaimer at the beginning that if for some chance we do get cut off because it's snowing and the power goes out where you're at and we're unable to access the internet, our sincere apologies in advance for cutting it short if that were to happen. So once again, thanks for joining us, Phyllis. I'd like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from originally, and what inspired you to start writing?
Well, I grew up in California in a small town in the northern part of the state called Grass Valley. And Grass Valley as I grew up, was a town of under 10,000 people and largely surrounded by 7 gold mines. Many of the people who came there were immigrants from Cornwall, England, where they had had experience in mining and came to what they thought was going to be a town where the streets were paved in gold. There was some truth in that because some of the trash rock from the mine was used in grading the road. And so you could say that the streets in Grass Valley were paved with gold, but not much. But I grew up there, went to school there, and after graduating at Grass Valley High School, went to the University of California in Berkeley. And it was in Berkeley, as a matter of fact, that I experienced my first earthquake, which you'll hear about as I talk about some of the disasters in the California book. From Berkeley, I stayed in that general area going to the Mount Diablo School District where I taught. And we were in Berkeley for a number of years. I met my husband on campus. We married there and stayed in that area while he was working for his doctorate and I was teaching in an elementary school. He then went off for a short term in the Army and we moved to New Jersey. And that turned out to be an interesting part of the world. We were there for a couple of years before returning to the Bay Area in California. After David received his doctorate, he took a position teaching in California and then moved to the University of Colorado. So our family has lived here in Colorado now for about 50 years.
Wow. So do you make it over to California for visits?
We make frequent visits, and the 2 states that are important to me are California and Colorado. And I've been writing a number of history books in connection with Colorado history, but I always thought it's too bad that I never did any writing while I was in California because there's so many fascinating things that go on there. So in speaking with an editor about doing a book on disasters in Colorado, I said, you know what, the state that really has had the interesting disasters is California. And so before I knew it, I'd agreed to do two books, California disasters and Colorado disasters. So it was interesting to do the research in both states.
Well, I'm really glad that you did write something about California disasters, because we certainly have had quite a few. And that brings me to my first question about the book itself. What kind of disasters are included in this book?
Well, California disasters covers 200 years of California history.
Wow.
And certainly there have been thousands of disasters, all of which can't be in this book. But I chose disasters that I thought would serve two purposes. One, be interesting to the reader, and two, be a fair description of some of the things that happened in the Golden State. Many of these disasters are the work of Mother Nature. If a tsunami comes sweeping in after an earthquake and inundates Crescent City, California, we just chalk that up to something Mother Nature did. If it decides to have a huge dust storm on a Thanksgiving weekend, catching hundreds of motorists out on the highway, unable to see where they're going, that's Mother Nature at work. But some of the disasters we don't credit to Mother Nature. We have to take responsibility for as caused by humans. If someone is fired from a job and is angry and decides to revenge themselves by doing away with the person who gave him a hard time, and goes up in an airplane and shoots a pilot and crashes a plane, we can't blame Mother Nature for that one.
No.
If a man decides to build a dam and thinks he has enough information gathered to do it right and makes an error, we can't blame Mother Nature for that. So the book has both kinds, man-made disasters, Mother Nature disasters, and some that are a combination where an underground mine has dangerous gases in it and a human comes and strikes a match. Then I think we give equal credit to Mother Nature and a mistake that humans have made.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Has there ever been anything really positive that came out of these disasters?
Yes, and that's one of the interesting things about working on them. People have said to me, isn't it a real downer to keep writing about disasters in two states? And I have to say no. There certainly are sad and tragic stories connected with all these disasters. Many lives lost, many buildings destroyed, towns ruined. But in these disasters, they happen to people, and people are ingenious and clever, and sometimes very brave. And so it's a sort of an introduction to the courage of individuals who suddenly find themselves in desperate situations. And so a lot of positives come out of it.
And that's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that I found when I was here in Salinas in 1989 during the Loma Prieta earthquake, which was scary. I mean, a lot of people lost their lives, and there was quite a bit of damage in the Bay Area. And I did, one of the positives for us that came out of it was that our neighborhood and our community really came together and helped each other, which was kind of I guess I was pleasantly surprised is how I would put it. Was everyone's power was out, so we all that night gathered all the frozen stuff that was going to go bad, and cooked it all up in big and ate, and we shared ice and kept stuff in coolers that we could do, so we were all helping each other, and it really brought us together. We ended up meeting a lot of neighbors that lived like far down the street that we hadn't met before, and we all just helped each other. It was really great. We
Yeah,
shared candles, and
that
I had
often
a bunch of
happens.
hurricane lamps that I had collected, and I let a bunch of people borrow different lamps so that they could they could see indoors without too much danger.
There are just countless stories like that, and some major ones where um, in one of the disasters I was reading about, which involved a lot of cars in a crash, a hitchhiker nearby just came, and if they weren't there, probably 7 people would have died in that accident because he was outside and able to pull open the doors, which were stuck and which they couldn't. So heroes emerge from these, and that's part of the good part about studying about disasters in the States.
That is a positive, and it's so heartwarming to hear of these people who step up in an emergency and uh, really selflessly often will help and save people. That's nice to know that there's some positives that come um, out of these disasters. We do have a comment. Uh, Richard writes, Phyllis, thanks for giving us a preview of your new book. So, so yes, and really thank you, because I'm excited. I just started reading it, so I haven't been able to finish yet. So I'm excited to hear a little more about the contents of the book. Um, I'm wondering, so is there a disaster that you would consider the worst disaster that's taken place in California?
There is. I think that the disaster you've been in is the one that's going to stand out for you if you've been in one of these. But as an outsider looking in, the disaster that strikes me as the worst in California history is one you don't hear a lot about. It's the flood, the Great Flood of 1868. California was experiencing a drought, which is not unusual. Various parts of the state right now are in a drought condition. And in this particular year, when it finally started to rain in November, everybody was happy, especially the farmers. But when it continued raining, not only in November and December, but in January and February, the earth just couldn't take in any more water, and all of the rivers began to flood. California is a long, big state, but picture it as it was that year, where a lake formed in the middle of California that was 300 miles long and 20 miles wide, because that's what happened in the Great Flood. Um, the rains just would not stop. It was time for the inauguration of the governor of the state, who that year was Leland Stanford. And instead of parades and banners and bunting and celebrations and so forth with an inauguration, they had to send a boat to his house, put him in the boat, and take the boat to the Capitol to hold the inauguration ceremony. Instead of a long ceremony with drinks and dinner and dancing and so on, they made the ceremony just as short as possible, put him back in a boat and took him home. By the time he got home, Leland Stanford had to climb in the second-story window of his house. Water in Sacramento in the streets in some places was 20 and 30 feet deep. They couldn't carry on business in Sacramento they temporarily moved the capital to San Francisco. So that flood, which took thousands of lives, there is no accurate number. In the northern part of the state, where there were lots of miners, there were a number of mining camps where Chinese laborers lived in groups together. And they estimate at least 1,000 of these men were swept off in the floodwaters. After the data was gathered, they estimated that at least 25% of all of the cattle and the sheep in the state of California were drowned. So it was a catastrophe, a disaster of really major proportions.
Yeah, it sounds like it was not just a disaster in the loss of life, human and animal, but it sounds as though it might have destroyed the cattle industry as well.
Well, it certainly set it back for a while, and property damage was just everywhere. I mean, it was hard to find a place, not only in northern and central California, but in the southern part of the state, that didn't suffer terribly from that 1868 flood.
Please, do you know or remember how long the waters took to recede from the Central Valley?
It took months. It did. Um, as I say, the rains began in November, and just for 5 months, basically, it rained. And it's just one of those times when there's a drought and the soil can take quite a bit of moisture in, but there comes a point when it just can't hold anymore, when trees are knocked out into rivers, just huge catastrophes almost anywhere along the way. And many people who had storage facilities by rivers and docks, warehouses just disappeared, including all the stuff that was in them. So I would say that was the biggest disaster in my mind that the state has endured.
And and that's one you don't really hear about. I mean, that was something that I only just learned from your book.
Well, it's not as well known. I would say that probably the most famous disaster in California, if you use the word Californian disaster in the same sentence, someone is very apt to pop up and say earthquake. And certainly the best known, I think, disaster in the state is the 1906 earthquake and fire in San Francisco. And that and fire is important because the earthquake struck in the early hours of the morning. And most people, or many people, were actually knocked out of bed. One of the interesting events of that earthquake was that the night before, Enrico Caruso, probably the best known tenor in the world, was in San Francisco at the Opera House, giving a magnificent performance. And next day, that night, of course, he went to a fancy hotel. He was on the 9th floor, and the earthquake hit. Caruso wrote about his experiences in a newspaper, and he said he awakened, went to the window, looked out, saw people running out in the street in their night clothes, pieces of buildings falling off. And of course, he didn't see it, but the Opera House he'd been in the night before was in ruins. So the earthquake itself did horrendous damage. At that time, San Francisco was the largest city in the state of California. It had a population of about 400,000 people. And as a result of that earthquake, they estimate 200,000 were homeless. It was a huge quake, and unfortunately, gas main pipes broke and fires broke out all over the city. one of the first people to be killed was the fire chief of the city, because the ceiling in the fire department just collapsed and killed him. Fires were everywhere. Soldiers came, National Guard came, fire department was out, and it looked as if there was just no way to stop this huge, massive fire that was just sweeping through the city. They finally decided the only way to stop it was to create a barrier it couldn't get over, and to do that, they were going to have to dynamite buildings. Well, dynamiting a building that hasn't been destroyed and that isn't on fire is a hard thing to do. And carrying explosives in an area where you're more than a few hundred feet from a blaze is an extremely dangerous thing to do. But they did blow up a number of buildings in the city and finally managed to get the fire stopped. Once it was stopped, you can imagine the aftermath. Huge committees formed to take care of immediate needs of food and housing for people, and trying to think, what to do first and second and third to get things going again. Banks suffered considerable damage, and not only were, in some cases, collapsed buildings, but they were afraid to open the safes, because in those safes was money that they needed and valuable papers. But the feeling was that the safe was so hot from the huge temperatures of the fires that to open it and to allow oxygen in might start a fire and burn up the contents of the safe. And so the banks did not open their vaults for a couple weeks after the earthquake hit.
Now, do you know who the first bank to open was?
Yes, it was the little old Bank of Italy.
I love this story because one of the most interesting things about history, local history and California history for me, is the amazing innovations that the founder of the Bank of Italy did for banking. I mean, he created branches, and nobody had branches before then.
That's
so
right.
He changed banking.
He opened his little bank, took out the money he had in it, actually put it in the bed of a fruit cart and put empty boxes on top so that he could go through the streets of the city, which were filled with people dragging anything that had wheels, baby carriages, wagons, with whatever they could get, heading toward the wharf. And he went to a spot not far from the wharf and actually opened his little bank. And this was Giannini and the Bank of Italy. He had to give out his loans just on a handshake because there was no office, no forms and things to fill out. He won so much goodwill and was so active that it wasn't long before he changed the name of the bank from the Bank of Italy to the Bank of America. And by
he had another reason for that too, because he could see how things were going in Europe.
That's right.
He was very concerned about Mussolini, and being thought of in that same context as Mussolini. And so he, as soon as he was able to buy a bank, he bought a Bank of America, and then changed the name of all his banks to Bank of America. So that was part of it too, was that he understood. He was a pretty savvy guy.
He was, and those branch banks, which up to then really hadn't existed, really caught on. And by 1950, the Bank of America was the largest banking institution in the world. So that's one of the interesting things that came out of that. With Caruso, he wanted out of San Francisco. His assistant dragged his suitcases and materials down 9 flights of stairs out to the wharf, and Caruso got onto the other side of the bay and vowed he'd never come back, and I don't think he ever did. Another interesting thing that happened is there were also people at that time in San Francisco in jails, and the prisoners were really worried. Were they just going to be left there? Were they going to be burned? What was going to happen to them? So they were marched by the National Guard down to the shore and put in a boat and taken out to Alcatraz. Because interestingly enough, the prison on Alcatraz, built on solid rock, didn't suffer at all from the earthquake. And so the San Francisco prisoners were taken there. Another fascinating thing to me was that at that time there were at least 20,000 and maybe twice that Chinese living in San Francisco. The majority of them were not citizens. And at that time, it was extremely difficult for a person from China to get citizenship in the United States. But they were wise because the city hall and its records were destroyed in the fire. And so all the Chinese had to do was to insist that they were born there and that their birth records and papers were burned. And that was just commonly accepted. So we gained a few thousand Chinese citizens as a result of that fire.
Well, that's a positive thing. You know, I do have to say that one of our Salinas citizens was experienced the San Francisco earthquake because he was in San Francisco at the time, and that was Lester Baranda, who was a local land grant or from a family of the Baranda, a large land grant from them when the Mexican government was in charge here, and he literally walked home from San Francisco to Salinas. And Salinas had lost, where we live, had lost 50% of its buildings during the San Francisco earthquake because it was so strong, and we felt it down here. And a lot of buildings went down, and so there's a lot of downtown buildings right where we're at. They were built in 1907. Not the one we're in at the moment. This is the old Oddfellows building, and it was built in 1875, and it did survive the 1906 earthquake and the 1989 earthquake. And that's where we're sitting right here. So hopefully it'll survive any future ones.
It's amazing how quickly rebuilding took place after that earthquake, because a lot of the city at that time was built on landfill around the edges of the city. And it, in the earthquake, I'm told, was like quicksand. A 3-story building might sink with 2 stories going down under the ground. Just amazing. And as I say, half the people in the city had lost a place to live. But rebuilding took place so quickly from the 1906 earthquake that in 1915, they hosted the World's Fair or World Exposition and sort of showed the world, look at the new San Francisco. So it's amazing what happened in a short period of time.
Well, it is amazing, especially considering the extent of the damage. I mean, we're looking at a earthquake in the 1989 Loma Prieta quake was a 7.1, and my understanding is that the San Francisco 1906 quake was an 8.1, which means it was 100 times stronger than the 89 quakes. And so for those of us who lived through the 1989 quake, imagining 100 times stronger is pretty difficult to imagine. It's like I imagine people were being tossed around,
And even a little quake, as I say, when I first went to the University of California, I was in the library studying one afternoon, and a small, very, very small earthquake hit. And the savvy people immediately knew what it was, and the person next to me grabbed me and pulled me under the table because bookshelves and so forth. And, it was very, very small, matter of just a few seconds, and it was over. But one never forgets that that special feeling when the earth is shaking. And
It's a very insecure feeling.
it's a feeling that once you felt it, you'll never be confused about it again. You'll know it.
Oh, that's for sure. In the '89 quake, I was working in a warehouse, and how they say that you can see the ground moving in waves. Well, I could actually see the cement moving in waves towards me, and that was just the most amazing. I can't, like, I can still picture it because it was such an amazing visual to see that the ground actually just kind of waving toward the cement. It was cement, but it was there. I could see it. I was like, well, now I always thought, well, that sounds like a bunch of BS. How could you see the ground move like in a wave? Well, it really did. and I and I'm here to say it. We have a comment from Facebook, and it's Richard Gary. He says, "This is Gary, your science writing buddy in Wellington,"
Yeah.
and he wanted to ask that if there was one disaster that was really interesting but didn't quite make the cut for this book.
Well, there were a number, but I would say that disasters, they're sort of hard to explain. For instance, do a lot of people have to be killed for it to be a disaster, or are just one or two deaths, but in a tragic way, a disaster? So I looked at lots of them, and some of them that were particularly interesting to me that didn't make the cut were disasters that happened in mines. Because, as I say, Grass Valley, where I grew up, was a gold mining community. The mine where my father worked had the deepest vertical shaft in the world. And so when I read about mining disasters, I did not include many of them until finally I wrote the Colorado disaster book. And I just had to put one in because those mining disasters were interesting to me because of proximity to them, but I wasn't sure how interesting they would be to the general public, whereas floods and fires and even avalanches that affect large areas seem to me have more appeal. So I would say that a few that didn't make the cut were mining disasters in California.
Well, that's interesting. I've been to Grass Valley, and it's just such a beautiful area. And it's just dotted everywhere with mines, both internal and I don't know what they call it, but external, where they were using like water just to wash away hillsides and sides of mountains looking for gold, which destroyed a lot of the environment. So that brings up kind of a question, is like, you said not many people had died, but there was obviously some mining created environmental disasters. Is that, would you agree?
It did. It did. And it's sometimes one of the disasters that I think is a major one is when Mount St. Helens blew. When you have a volcano that's been extinct forever, no one living has ever seen any activity, and yet suddenly it becomes active, and you have a volcano with spewing lava, you expect huge numbers of deaths. And yet in that particular disaster, to the best of my knowledge, not a single life was lost. So disasters just take many, many forms.
Yeah, that's definitely true. That's definitely that makes a lot of sense that they would. And I hadn't really think so much about the environmental disaster of Mount St. Helens, but yeah, that was a big deal. Um, what's the Let's see. I had another question I wanted to ask. Which is there a what disaster lasted the longest of the ones in your book?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there was one disaster that it appeared that the results and connections with it would never come to an end. And that happened in the 1850s in California. Transportation to a large extent was done by paddle boats, because stagecoaches provided transportation that was not too fast and not too comfortable. But when paddle boats were used, and the first ones that were introduced were not very big, about 90 feet long, but gradually they got bigger and bigger, and some of them quite luxurious. And so paddle boat travel between 1850 and 1890 became very substantial, both for goods and for passengers. And there was a paddle boat by the name of the Brother Jonathan. And Brother Jonathan began its career as a paddle boat on the East Coast, was bought by a millionaire and moved out to the West Coast, and began making regular trips from San Francisco up to Portland. And the Brother Jonathan had been loaded in San Francisco and was ready to take off on an important trip. The captain of the ship took a look at it in the water and saw how deep it was sitting there, and said there was, in his opinion, too much cargo on it. And the owners said this is what was going, and if he didn't want to captain it, then find someone else to. So he eventually took off in the Brother Jonathan, and they had a relatively simple trip. Lots of important people were on board, including a man who had just been appointed the new territorial governor for the northern part of what was the United States. They also had an owner of a newspaper. They had a couple government officials who were carrying gold and paper money to pay the troops and our army personnel that were in the northern corner of the United States. So the ship went off, had a relatively simple time until it got to Crescent City. And at Crescent City, they stopped, unloaded some things, took on a couple passengers, and set out north again. Huge storm came up, and the captain decided that with his very heavy ship and the disastrous waves that were coming, that the smart thing to do was to turn around and go back and harbor at Crescent City and ride out the storm there. So they turned the ship around, went back toward Crescent City, and the area at that point, there were no lighthouses in that area of the coastline. It wasn't well charted and well marked. And there's a reef not far from shore there, with sharp pinnacles of rock going straight up from the ocean floor a couple hundred feet. And the ship was taken and smashed by a wave down on one of these sharp pieces of rock, a hole ripped into the bottom of the boat. And the cries went up on ship of the damage, but before anybody could do anything, another wave crashed it down on another one, ripping a second hole. And so it became clear that the ship was going to sink and there's nothing they could do to save it. The captain told the crew to save as many lives as they could. So they began lowering their lifeboats, but the storm was such that, first of all, it was difficult to get a lifeboat out and into the water. And partway down, they would either tip over or smash into the boat. Only one of the lifeboats actually made it into the water. The crew member had taken 3 or 4 women and a few children, about 6 crewmen, 19 in all. And this is all that was saved from the several hundred people that were on the ship. So 19 people made it to shore. And that was a disaster of major proportions, but it didn't end there, because a lot of people said, one of the things we have to do is to build a lighthouse along the shore at this point. And so a bill was brought up in Congress to build such a lighthouse. Monies were not plentiful after the Civil War, but they did donate some money for this purpose and start to build the St. George Reef Lighthouse. They weren't sure they could even build one there because they could only work for a small part of the year because of the storms. They didn't know how they were going to get the building supplies they needed. But they took a boat, lashed it out there at the reef, brought in huge stones, and managed to put a base and a lighthouse there. It took a long time, until 1892, before the lighthouse was fully lighted and operational. It was interesting to me that one of the first lighthouse keeper was a man who had helped build it. So that disaster that had begun in 1865, it was 1892 before the lighthouse, which was sort of a result of that disaster, happened. And that is still not the end of the disaster, because stories had circulated for years about the sinking of the Brother Jonathan and the fact that there were golden coins aboard that ship and a rich treasure to be found. So at least 24 companies that look for buried treasure had searched for the remains of the Brother Jonathan and a chance to get this gold. Finally, using a submersible, they were able to locate the spot where the Jonathan had sunk and to bring up a few items and to realize they'd really found the spot, and that with intensive searching there, they were going to be successful. This immediately set the state of California into a tizzy, because they were maintaining that anything found that close to shore belonged to the state of California, not to a treasure hunting company. The treasure hunting company maintained they'd spent 2 years searching and several $100,000, and this treasure belonged to them. So, of course, it ended up in court. And the first court finding on it really found in favor of the state of California. The company appealed, and it went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided not to hear the case and referred it back to a lower court, where arguments began all over again. And long story short, it was 1999 before the decision was finally agreed to by both sides, giving part of the treasure to the state, part to the company, and the 1,600 coins, which were eventually brought up, were divided, and some were specially sent to museums in the state of California. I've not seen one of these, but it would be very interesting to see one of the coins from the Brother Jonathan. So that's the the disaster that had the longest period of ramifications and a very interesting history, I think.
Yes, that's absolutely fascinating, actually. Especially the fact that they found some treasure. I mean, that to me, that's always been an exciting thought, is to uncover, whether it's in the ocean or in the ground, some buried treasure, because people did bury coins and stuff back in the day. People who didn't trust banks would often it really, instead that, that instead of putting it in the mattress, they might bury a can or a jar with some money in it in the backyard or in the back 40 somewhere.
Well, they never did find the safe.
Oh,
They felt that in the safe there might be other valuable things, but they did find 1,600 of the gold coins. So that was a successful treasure hunt.
I would guess so. I think maybe someone will find the safe one day. That would be pretty fun.
It would be.
I love stories like that. That's great. Would it is what were two of the most dramatic disasters in your book?
Well,
Or even
again, it's
one?
sort of hard to choose, but I think that the fact that a volcano suddenly appears and erupts is one of the most dramatic ones that I can think of. And Lassen Peak in the northern part of the state had not had any activity at all for a long, long time. And suddenly, it was in 1914, people noticed a sort of a rosy glow above Lassen, and also heard some sort of strange sounds. 3 men went up to investigate. They were kind of curious as to what was happening up here on the top of the mountain. They reported that as they looked down, they saw molten lava, and a crater had formed on the top of Lassen Peak. And not only that, but it began spitting rocks out while they were there. One of the men actually got hit by a rock thrown out by the volcano. So they went scurrying down, and people wondered what would happen. But for a year, other than a few rumbles and a glow in the sky, not much happened. And it was on May 22nd. Matter of fact, this weekend will be 107 years ago that peak erupted in a volcano. The smoke from that and the gases from that volcano went up 30,000 feet in the air and could be seen for 150 miles. And that must have been one of the, I think, most dramatic things to have happened in the state. The lava began spilling down the mountain. It's an area that, at least at that time, was not much in the way of population. And the reports were that a farmer, partway down the mountain, was awakened that night by his dog barking, and went out to look and saw that the lava had whipped up trees and rocks into the creek or river that was nearby, and it was all moving very, very slowly down the hill like a gigantic destructive machine. He ran almost a mile down to the next farmhouse, and they alerted everyone so that no one was hurt. But a huge area was completely ruined by the volcanic explosion. Was given the name of the devastated area. And there were just miles, which you can still see because it's included in the volcanic park there. where every tree shrub was killed, where huge rocks came crushing down the side. So that's got to be one of the most dramatic ones, I think, even though no one was killed. An area was devastated and the explosion was massive. The other one that stands out to me as dramatic is very different, and that is the failure of the St. Francis Dam. And again, that's one that one doesn't hear a lot of, but it's all tied to a man called William Mulholland. And Mulholland was an immigrant from Ireland who came to New York, stowed away on a ship, got as far as Panama, was discovered, taken off the ship, walked 50 miles across the Isthmus of Panama, and finally got to California. He got there and became a tremendous influence on the city of Los Angeles. In 1887, Los Angeles had only about 10,000 people. Within 50 years, it had more than 1 million people. What that meant, among other things, was a real necessity to find a water supply. And Mulholland, when he got there, was hired as a ditch tender for the city of Los Angeles. He tended his ditches during the day, and at night he studied and really learned all that he could about the field of engineering. A very bright man, he rose through the ranks and in time became superintendent of water for the city of Los Angeles. Under his supervision, he built 5 reservoirs, and those reservoirs are still existing today and still helping supply water for the Los Angeles area. He also built a series of aqueducts and bought up land sort of secretively and made some enemies while doing it, but ended up with an aqueduct that took water about over 200 miles into the city of Los Angeles. So he had done a lot, but he still wasn't confident about the water supply for the city. One of his fears was that there would be an earthquake and that an earthquake could cause some major damage to this aqueduct. Also, the people who felt he was stealing water that they needed to take it down to Los Angeles frequently vandalized pieces of the aqueduct because they were just plain mad. They felt they'd been robbed of their water. So he decided the only way he could feel really comfortable was if he could have a year's supply of water. And to do that, he would have to build a dam. And so he built a dam across 2 rock outcroppings on the San Francisco River there. And it was a big undertaking. It cost $1.3 million to build the dam. And at that time, it was the largest, what they call arch dam in the world. From the very beginning, people maintained that this dam leaked. And it's true that leakage could be seen near the bottom of the dam, but it didn't appear to be major. 2 powerhouses were built, one above and one below the dam. And on this one occasion in 1928, one of the keepers at the powerhouse noticed an unusual amount of leakage, at least so it seemed to him, enough so that he was worried and called into the main office, talked to Mulholland, and Mulholland and his chief engineer came out to the dam, and they spent the better part of a day there checking things out, making sure that this was just an ordinary small amount of leakage, nothing to worry about. They satisfied themselves that that was the case and went back to their offices. But 3 days later, at 2 minutes before midnight, the side of the dam cracked and gave way. And there were 20 billion gallons of water behind that dam that came rushing down. The keeper of the light of the powerhouse gathered his wife and children, ran to the door of the house, and by the time they got to the door of his house, the water was already 5 feet deep in the doorway. They were just swept out. The powerhouse manager found himself tangled in wires from a power pole, and he finally freed himself from it and got up to the surface to breathe and hung onto the pole, which went down the river, crashed into a house. He managed to get on the roof of the house and stay on the roof of the house until it crashed into the bank, when he leaped off and survived this. It's uncertain as to how many people were drowned, but certainly several hundred. Bodies were found all up and down the creeks and rivers there. The dam was never rebuilt, and it was decided that at that time there was no state authority that okayed the plans, and that the foundations of the dam, although they were the best that Mulholland could come up with, were not sufficient for the height of the dam that they had built. There was a lot of investigations and court proceedings, and Mulholland himself was just devastated. He said in the courtroom that if any human error was involved in this disaster, the error was mine. He took full responsibility for it. He wanted to resign immediately. They didn't accept his resignation at the time, but he did resign and leave about 10 months later. But pictures of the dam, and there are in the book, I think one of the interesting things about it, there are dozens of pictures from archives of the dam, and was a huge structure, and to see it with one side just completely ripped off, and to think how it must have been with all that water gushing down the various rivers, had to be, I think, one of the most dramatic of the disasters in the book.
It sounds like not only was it maybe the most dramatic, it also sounds like it maybe could double as the most unlucky one.
Well, not the most unlucky one.
Of course, it's not the most.
At least to me, there was one where I felt this was really unlucky. Again, it involved a paddle boat. And this was in 1851. California had just become a state. It was in September. And news was slow to reach California from Washington at that time. And so it was October before people got all ready for the celebration. And they were having parades and dances and feasts and parties to celebrate the fact that California was now a state of the Union. And this was in 1851, and a paddle boat had brought visitors up for the day to enjoy all the festivities that were going on. And shortly after 6 o'clock, that paddle boat left. Now, those boats were powered by steam engines, and the steam engines sometimes exploded. And that's exactly what happened on this occasion. While it was still within sight of shore, uh, the engine on the Sagamore paddle boat exploded. The captain was thrown 50 feet into the air and out into the water. He did survive, but a lot of the passengers were killed, and many of them were cut, broken bones, and terrible burns from the steam. A rescue party was organized very quickly. Um, Many small boats from all over that particular coastal area went out to be of help, took people from the paddle boat and put them in their boats and rowed or get them back to shore. Um, some of them were okay, others required hospitalization, and they were sent to several different hospitals in San Francisco. A group of about a half a dozen went to a hospital, and totally unrelated to this event, that very night, the hospital caught fire. And it caught fire in that section where those people who had just been rescued from the fire were, and they were, again, burned and injured in the hospital. And that was a kind of a double whammy. So I think that was the most unlucky disaster in the book, is to have blown up, been taken to the hospital, and burned again.
Okay, I agree with you there. That is pretty unlucky with a double whammy. Um, we're pretty much reached the end of our hour here. I do want to say we did have a comment from Jeannie Scheel, who's a local resident here, and she says she never knew that Lassen was a volcano. So she learned something new with your with your talk tonight. And then we have another comment from Glenda Lloyd, and she says, "Thank you for the wonderful stories and facts that you're able to share by memory." So, and I want to thank you for that too. I think this has been very informative. I can't wait to finish your book. I've learned so much from it already, and just from talking with you tonight. And thank you so much for being here. I do want to ask you one more question though, if we have time, and that is, what was the most? Let's land on a happy note, hopefully. What was the most romantic disaster in your book?
Well, it's hard to think of romance coming out of one of these disasters, but one did. In 1998, there were earthquakes that are generally called the North Ridge earthquake, and these affected a fairly large piece of area, and particularly the area near Santa Monica. And one of the buildings that was destroyed, or at least badly damaged in that quake, was an apartment building. And in the building, living at that time, was a young man whose name was Mark Kubesi. And he was able to get out of his apartment without any difficulty. But other parts of the building were damaged so that people were stuck inside and couldn't get out. And he's credited with helping rescue about 5 people from that one apartment building. One of the people who was trapped was a woman up on the 3rd floor, and he could see her through the window, but the halls and walls and doorways were so damaged she couldn't get out. So he managed to get a long ladder over to the window so that she could come down, but she was afraid. It was a rickety ladder. She'd just been in an earthquake. How on earth could she climb out the window and go down a ladder? And so Mike went up the ladder, helped her out the window, onto the ladder, down, and to safety. And that's how they met. A year later, they married. And so we had a romance that came out of this one. And he went on, by the way, to Hollywood. He was a well-known photographer and who ended up doing a lot of the photography for Grey's Anatomy and NCIS. And I hope that Mike and Patricia have a long life together, but at least that's where their romance began.
What a wonderful story. And once again, Phyllis, thank you so much for joining us today and telling us about your book. I wanted to let everyone know before we go that anyone watching tonight who would like to have a signed book plate by the amazing Phyllis Perry, uh, just simply email the Downtown Book and Sound at gmail.com or send a private message on Facebook. We're happy to mail a signed book plate by the author anywhere in the US at no charge as a special thank you for joining us tonight. And then I also want to let everyone know that California Disasters by Phyllis Perry is available on bookshop.org and also in our bookstore, Downtown Book and Sound, in beautiful downtown Salinas. And it looks like we've got through the whole hour without the power going out in Colorado from the snowstorm that's happening right now. So that's a blessing. So luckily that wasn't a little disaster. For tonight. But I really just want to make sure everyone knows that bookshop.org is the independent bookstore's answer to Amazon, and all proceeds go to independent bookstores. So please support local bookstores because we support local authors, and we promote books about local things like, in this case, disasters. So, Phyllis, I want to thank you again for being here, and it was very informative, and I'm sure to the audience as well.
Thank you. And I do want to say to those of you from Colorado who are listening that Colorado Disasters with Far Country Press should be out by the 1st of September. And so if you've not had enough of disasters, please check in then, and I'll look forward to talking with you.
Thanks again, Phyllis. We're going to sign off now. And once again, California Disasters by Phyllis Perry, available now. And in September, Colorado Disasters is coming out. We'll be carrying that at Downtown Book and Sound as well. And I'm sure that will also be available on bookshop.org. So thanks again. Have a good night. And everyone, thank you for joining us today.